Hello, everybody. My name is Seper Namdar from DDD Iran. I would like just to start the webinar. I would like to first of all thank you, Masood, helping us to planify this big event. It's a big event for us. We are so proud to welcome Nick Toon, which is one of the author of Pattern, Principle, and Practices of Domain-Driven Design. Is one of my favorite books on DDD domain. I would like to also thank SOAT sponsoring this webinar, recording the video and manage logistics. So Nick, I will let you start. I will not talk a lot. I know that people are here to listen to you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Can you hear me okay? Anyone can hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Cool. So thank you for inviting me to your meetup. Great opportunity we might not have had if it wasn't for COVID. So I know it's not the best time for everyone, but there have been some positives. I still haven't managed to get my hair cut yet, so please excuse me for all of this stuff on your screen. I have managed to book an appointment for 2 weeks, so this will be my last public speaking before I get a haircut. So I'm really excited about that. And hopefully you're going to be really excited about the bounded context canvas after this talk. So before we get to the canvas, I just want to cover some basic concepts about why we do what we do. So when we think about software development, software architecture, even just our lives in general, we always like to break things down. We like to take one big thing and break it into lots of smaller things. You know, a book is broken down into chapters. The world itself is composed of many countries. We like to take a day and break it down into 24 hours. And in our software, we like services, we like classes, we like methods. So we're kind of a bit fascinated by this decomposition stuff. But have you ever wondered why we do this? Have you ever just tried to list all of the reasons why this is useful? Because often it's very just a natural thing. So I've been thinking about this over the years, and I think there are like 5 main reasons why we do this. So the first one is actually about our ability to think about things. So breaking things down into smaller chunks means we can focus on just a small chunk and not the whole thing. The example I like to use here is, imagine if you wanted to make a small change to some code, but you had to load every single line of code, the entire code base in your head just to touch one line. That would be crazy, right? So the reason we break things down into smaller pieces is so that we can think about and make changes to small pieces on their own. One of the other benefits is about things being able to evolve independently. We take this thing, we break it down into small pieces. Each of those small pieces can be changed on its own. And if we're talking about software architecture, that means the teams that own them can work quite autonomously and independently. We also have the business perspective. And what I'm trying to say here is, if we break a system down, if we break a software architecture into these services, we can spend our time and effort on the parts of the system where the payback is greatest. Oh, this service over here, if we add 2 new features, we'll get 10,000 new customers in 2 weeks. Oh, wow, that's cool. Let's invest in that one. And let's not be slowed down by other bits of code that are unrelated to it. We also get the ability to apply different rules and conventions if we break things down into separate pieces. So a good example here is, if I have microservices, I can customize each microservice using a different programming language. I can do some Java over here, .NET over here. You get the idea. And we also have containment. If I break things down into small pieces or smaller pieces, if we do something stupid or crazy in one place and we make a mess, it won't affect other things. So there are lots of benefits to decomposing systems. but there are also some problems, because it's great that we can think about small pieces on their own, but then we can get too focused on small pieces and lose sight of the bigger picture. And we think the system works differently to how it does. This can then also contribute to local optimizations. We make changes in one part of the system which makes sense here, but overall, it makes things worse for the entire system. We also get politics. Break a system down into smaller pieces. Each team owns a different piece. Each team has different goals and priorities, but they're all trying to survive with dependencies between them. We start seeing concepts like empire building. Each team has to prove that they're the best and blame other teams when things go wrong. So there are problems here. We also get duplication. Two services, two teams. Why would they collaborate when they can just duplicate things each? Sometimes that's a good idea, sometimes it's not a good idea. And we also get poor alignment. We get these silos, teams going in different directions, not thinking about what other teams are working on. So we do have a balancing act here when we break a system down. And so domain-driven design says you should break your system down into subsystems called bounded contexts. And bounded contexts are linguistic boundaries. And whenever I say that, people always say to me, what's a linguistic boundary? What does that have to do with software and architecture and DDD? I'm lost. Can you explain things, please? So what we mean is, if we want to find good boundaries, if we want to break a large system down into subsystems, and we want to have the virtues and minimize the problems, domain-driven design says you should look at the way people speak, look for the language in the domain, look for boundaries in the language, and use that as the basis for your software architecture. And those are called bounded contexts. And so if you imagine a system and you had a context for science, over in science, a tomato is a fruit because it matches the botanical definition of a fruit. Scientifically, a tomato is a fruit. You can't really argue with that. But if you're cooking, if you're doing something about cooking, then you would consider a tomato a vegetable because it's used in dishes where a vegetable flavor is needed. So in DDD, what we would say is don't try and create one model of tomato and confuse these unrelated things about science and cooking. Create two contexts and two models of a tomato. But we're still quite far away from software and architecture here. So what's the point of this? So the point is, if we look for these boundaries in language and we have separate models for the same concept in different contexts, not only do we have a loosely coupled architecture, but we also get more loosely coupled teams, and ideally we'll have minimum dependencies between them. And I don't know if you've seen the DevOps research, the DevOps studies, but Nicole Forsgren, Jez Humble, and Gene Kim, I think they've been talking to companies for like 6 or 7 years now, doing these annual research surveys. And surprisingly, or maybe not surprisingly, what they found is companies that have a loosely coupled software architecture and a loosely coupled teams, those companies are most likely to have the best continuous delivery performance, delivering higher quality software on a more frequent basis. So that's why bounded contexts are kind of important. You know, language is how we decouple things, and that decoupling in our code based on domain language goes all the way to autonomous teams, continuous delivery, performing more successfully as a company. So it's not just tomatoes, linguistic boundaries. There is there is some point to all of this stuff. But you might be thinking, look, I've heard about bounded context. I eat tomatoes. You're not teaching me anything here. I want to learn something in this meetup tonight. I want to know, how do we design bounded context? I've heard the theory before. I've seen all the marketing. I've read the DDD books. Give me something useful. How would you design bounded contexts? With the bounded context canvas, of course. You might have guessed from the title of this talk where it was going. So I'm hoping that the whole point of this talk is it's something new, it's something different, it's something useful. I'm not going to talk about the same things every other DDD talk talks about. I want to provide something new, but not theoretical, actually practical and useful. So first of all, the bounded context is like a checklist. It's like before you commit to an architecture, before you start building an architecture, here's a checklist of things you should probably think about for each new service or each new bounded context. And in fact, the bounded context canvas, I started working on this maybe 3 years ago, and it was just a checklist. I started with 2 questions and then 3 questions. And each time I worked on a new system or worked with a new client, I added more questions to it. What's cool about the canvas, and it's even better than a checklist, is that you get everything in a visual format. And when you put all of your choices in a visual format laid out together, you can start to connect the dots. You see problems. Oh, this thing over here and this thing over here, that doesn't make sense. Or you see opportunities, or you start thinking about different ways the system could be modeled. So here's an example of a bounded context canvas. It's not a real canvas, but it's based on a system I might have worked with in the past. So in the top left-hand corner, we have the name. So this bounded context is a register of the business property taxes that each company in the country has paid in the past 20 years. So it's like a list. In 1995, this company paid this much business property tax. And it's important because it's necessary. The government has to do this. They're required to by law. So if you look across the canvas, you can see the classification. How important is this context to the business? We've got business rules and policies. We've got ubiquitous language. We start looking at the interface. What messages come in and what messages go out of the context? Does that make sense? And then we have the dependencies and relationships. Who do we depend on? Who depends on us? And this is important because this is the coupling in the system. And what we want to say is, does that coupling make sense here? Could we remove that coupling somehow? So if we had this canvas, we could ask the question, what is wrong with this design? Or what could be better with this design? Now we have all of this information presented visually. What could we do differently? What decisions could we make differently, or options could we explore that would give us a better design? When we talk about a better design, we're going back to loosely coupled, autonomous teams, improving our company's performance. That's why we care about the design. So the name, I think the name's good. Problems are like a manager, or a name that's too generic, like utils. Description. This description is good. I think it's clear in business language. Classification. Does this make sense? Now, it sounds very simple. It's just a database of the tax, how much each company paid over the past 20 years. It might be important because it's a legal requirement, but is that a core domain? I'm not sure. We'll come back to these things later. And now we look at the business decisions. So we've got a publication dates and approval. And now we're talking about comparing. Like, this concept of comparing is not mentioned in the name or the description. Maybe that doesn't belong here, or maybe it does belong here, and the description and the name don't fully describe what this context is about. Also, we've got our ubiquitous language here, but we've got nothing about taxes. I'm pretty sure there's some domain terminology missing here that we should all know about. The model traits looks good. We'll talk about that later. Commands, import survey, publish a register. Yeah, they're okay. Trust me, I worked in the domain. They're okay. Don't worry. The events, talking about a register being published, a draft being published. Consistent, coherent, aligns with the name and description. I think that's good. But then we look at the queries. Get user profile. Wait a minute. This context has nothing to do with a user profile. That query does not belong on this context. Nobody should be calling this context and getting a user profile. That doesn't make sense. That's a definite red flag. We need to look at this one. Dependencies, yeah, we're happy with that. Two coming in, two going out. Makes sense. That's good. So you're probably thinking, okay, the canvas looks useful. I didn't understand all of that stuff because I haven't worked in that domain, but I get the idea. But then you might be thinking, well, how do I get all of the information to put on the canvas in the first place? Like that's the hard part, right? Getting the information is easy. I mean, looking at it's easy, but getting it, that's not, the canvas doesn't solve that problem, does it? No, it doesn't. And that's why we have also recently published this modeling process. So basically, we go through each of these steps in the process, and it helps us to collect the information we need to put on the canvas. So I just want to point out, this is the starter process. It's a beginner's process. We're not trying to say you should do this on every project, but if you don't know where to start, or you've got a bounded context canvas and you're wondering, how do I get the information? This process is a great place to start. It's based on how we teach DDD, the kind of processes we use ourselves. And this is all available on GitHub. So if you go to github.com DDD crew, you'll see the bounded context canvas, you'll see the modeling process. It's 100% free. It's Creative Commons. You can use it however you want to. And we also accept pull requests and issues. So if at any point during this talk, you're thinking, this idea sucks, I can do it much better, I look forward to seeing your pull request. It will be very welcome. We're not saying these tools are perfect. We're saying it's a community effort. We want to make domain-driven design easier and better for everyone, and all contributions are welcome. So I think that's pretty exciting. And we've had a few people already putting ideas forward to improve these tools. So it seems to be working. We also have some free Miro templates you can use if you want to apply these concepts remotely in an online format. So that was the intro to this talk. In the remaining 30 minutes or so, I'm going to go through these three topics. So firstly, I'll quickly take you through that process of how to get the information for the canvas. I'll then take you through each section on the canvas, and then I'll give you a super sneak preview of version 4 of the bounded context canvas, which is new, it's not finished yet, and it's open to new ideas and suggestions if you're interested. And then we have a QA after. So, finding boundaries. This isn't a talk about finding boundaries, but I want to quickly go over some main things. So, you're in a situation where you don't have any bounded contexts, you don't know where to start, the canvas looks nice, but what do I do? Well, here's what you do. Start with event storming. This is a great way to map out your domain. Then you can start breaking your event storm down into possible bounded contexts, grouping events and commands which seem to be related to each other. And at this point, we're just looking for a baseline to work from. We're going to be iterating on it later with the canvas. There are some heuristics you can use for finding those boundaries. I won't talk about all of these for now, but you can get the slides later. And then we challenge the model with use cases. So we start saying, given the scenario where a user wants to place an order, what messages need to flow between these bounded contexts to make that happen? And this helps us to see some coupling we might not have thought of. A lot of people start with a static view, take an event storm, break it into context and think that's it. But no, it's important to challenge the hidden coupling. And if you've seen Eric Evans' work, he calls this the model exploration whirlpool. You can try this at the code level or the architectural level. But once we've done this, we've got a high level idea of what could the bounded context be. Just a starting point. we've looked at the message flows, we're not sure yet, but we've got something to work from, we can then move that information to the canvas and start using the canvas to go into the details and look for some missing possibilities. So just wanted to clarify, if you're ever not sure, what should I do next? Check out this starter modeling process and use that as a way to decide, where am I in the journey? What could I do next? Okay, so let's actually look at the canvas itself now and go through each of the sections. So the first part of the canvas is the name and the description. And I always try to stress to people, don't rush this, because it's harder than it looks. So naming is one of those things where when you name something, it's very hard to change the name later. If you give your bounded context a very generic name like manager or utils or something like that, it's going to be a recipe for everything getting stuck in there. So thinking of a good name not only clarifies what the bounded context does, but what it doesn't, and what you want it to be in the future, which things you don't want to end up in there. And one thing I find interesting from doing this canvas is the description section. There are a couple of things I like about the description. So firstly, people will say, yeah, I think we need a sales context or a fleet context. And someone else will say, yeah, I looked at the event store and we need a fleet context. But then when you ask those people to write down in just 2 sentences, describe your fleet context, you'll get 2 completely different answers from different people, even though they gave it the same name. And just this act of forcing people to put their ideas in writing brings to the surface some obvious mismatches that, that if you don't think about them now, people continue in the process thinking they're talking about the same thing when they're not. Something else I found interesting is the word and. When you have a description and it contains the word and, it's always a sign that maybe this thing is doing 2 things. So whenever you see the word and in a description, you can always say, what if we make those ands 2 things? And it gives you just an alternative way of modeling, just another choice to think about for free, very easy. So when I talk about a description, what do I recommend? So firstly, I say, try and talk in the business benefits it provides. And also try and explain why. What does it do? Why does it do them? And try and avoid technical jargon. When we're looking at this level, we don't really care if it's CQRS, event sourcing, NoSQL, microservices. We're not talking about that at this level. Imagine you're talking to the CEO or the CTO, and he says, what's that bounded context you're working on, and why does it matter to me? Yeah, that's the kind of person you're trying to convince, someone in the business, explaining to them why it's important to them and why they should invest in it. So from my example earlier, you can see that I start with the what. It's a register of business taxes paid by each business in the past 20 years. That's all business, no tech. And then I explain why. This is a required legal obligation. So if I'm in the elevator and the CEO or the CTO comes in, I can say to them, this thing I'm working on, this bounded context, is a legal obligation you have to provide. And it keeps taxes for the past 20 years. And he or she will look at you and say, okay, we need you, we need that context. It's an essential thing. And they'll leave you to do your work. Then we get to something interesting and a bit more difficult, which is strategic classification. And so this is a free text field, but I've put some placeholders in there as a starting point of things you might want to think about. So firstly, we have how important is this context in the domain to the company? So a core domain is the parts of the system that we think as a company, these are the most important parts that we need to focus on. We can also talk about the business model and what role this bounded context plays in the business model. So is this a feature that customers pay for, or is it something they don't pay for? Is it an engagement feature? I'll come to an example of this. And then I won't go into evolution too much, but this is based on Simon Wardley's Wardley Mapping. And we want to work out, does this bounded context represent a brand new idea, which could be one of the biggest innovations in 5 years' time? Or is this an idea that's been around for a long time and all of our competitors have this feature and it's basically a commodity? There's no differentiation here. And I think these things are super important because every decision you make in a software architecture has consequences at the business level. You know, where you place boundaries has an impact on how much autonomy teams have. And so every architectural decision has those business trade-offs and needs to be made by explaining, we chose a bounded context with these boundaries and these responsibilities because our business model is this, and we think this is the best architecture because it enables some reason. So another problem people have had is with core domains. I've seen people who've been doing domain-driven design for 10 years arguing about what's a core domain and how you find it. And then I've seen people who've just got new to DDD and they ask, what's a core domain and how do I find it? And they see these DDD experts arguing about core domains. Like, how much do you feel as a beginner if these experts can't even agree what this word means? How are you supposed to do anything? It's impossible. So what we decided was, we think that a core domain, firstly, has high business differentiation. If our company does this thing really well, we can do it differently to our competitors, and that will give us a business advantage. But it also needs to be complex. If it's a simple CRUD system, it can't be our core domain. So I'm not going to talk about this too much today, but this is also open source Creative Commons on GitHub. So github.com, DDD crew, core domain charts. There are some different recipes for doing this technique and some examples, so feel free to take a look. One of the examples is the first to market core. So if you have a core domain which has high business differentiation, but you're saying, well, it's a very simple system to implement, you know that because it's simple, your competitors will be able to develop this feature very easily, so it won't be your core domain in 6 months or 1 year. And you need to be thinking about your next core domain. So that's just one pattern of many different patterns, many different kinds of core domain. When I talk about business model role, think about search. Think about Google search or Bing search. What's their core domain? Is their core domain the search, or is it advertising, or is it GDPR? Now, as a user of Google and Bing, I don't pay any money for the search. So surely advertising must be their core domain because advertising makes money. But no, actually, because if you didn't have a search engine, you wouldn't be able to place any ads. So this is why on the canvas, we think the business model role is important. It helps people to think about, why is this context important and what does it do? How does it contribute to the business model? And then for the final part, there's the evolution. There's this concept called Wardley Mapping. As you can see, it's quite complicated. So I'm not going to talk about that today, but I do recommend learning it if you get an opportunity. So the next section of the canvas is about business rules and policies and ubiquitous language. So we want to, if we're saying a context is important, what important decisions does it make? Do they make sense to belong in this context? And also language. If I'm a developer working on this bounded context, what's the most important language I need to know about? Which concepts and phrases are the most important? And we can collaborate with domain experts on these things. We can say to the domain experts, does it make sense for these rules to live here? Are these the words and phrases that you think are most important in this context? Now, it's not always easy to find those business rules and the ubiquitous language. So what you can try is a version of event storming called process modeling. So you can apply this to a single bounded context. And basically, a user issues a command, produces an event, and there's a policy which listens for the event and makes a decision. So the policy here is a decision. So by doing process modeling for your bounded context, you uncover all of these decisions and you can pick out the most important ones, and the same for the language that's used. So then we get to model traits. And this is confusing, and people don't understand this easily. And I don't even know how to explain it easily. And we're discussing whether we should remove it from the canvas. But I think it's useful because there are patterns in the way bounded contexts behave. So it's like a personality test. And if you know the kind of personality your bounded context has, it helps you to understand the trade-offs and the decisions you would make based on this personality. So let me give you an example. So Alberto Brandolini, he talks about these three archetypes. So some bounded contexts are draft contexts. So in a draft context, people are adding lots of information and changing it. And it's like, it's not finalized yet. Once it's finalized, it gets handed over to an execution context. An execution is normally managing or following a process. Imagine you're taking a cab in like Uber or a similar company in the country you're living in. You might have an execute bounded context which tracks the journey, follows the car, follows the cab on the map and stuff, and keeps a record. Then you might have an audit context which keeps a record of all the journeys that happened in the past. So by identifying which of these roles our bounded context plays, we can start to see anti-patterns. If I have an execute context, but I'm keeping lots of historical data, maybe I've got an execute context and an audit context, and we should split them up into two. There are also other things I would call traits, like an enforcer or an octopus enforcer, which makes sure other contexts are complying with some rules in the system. And also Eric Evans talks about a bubble context, a context which hides other contexts, but eventually the bubble will pop as the old legacy system is replaced. So I didn't have time to go into model traits too much, but we've put some examples on the GitHub page, which you can take a look at. And then we get to the interface of your bounded context. So which messages are coming in and which messages are going out. So we have three kinds of message. A command is an instruction to do something. Bounded context A says to bounded context B, you must do something. An event is a notification. Hey, this thing just happened. You might care about this. And a query is a request for information. Can I have all of the users who didn't pay their bill? I'm going to go send them a nasty email and make them pay, or scare them. So one of the clarifications here is that when we talk about messages, we don't mean asynchronous messages on a message bus. We're talking about logical semantics. So everything is a command, a query, or an event. So if you're posting a form on a web page and the data in that form is your command, you're saying, add this item to my basket. There might be no asynchronous message, but logically it's a command. You're sending an instruction. A synchronous GET request is a query. And if you have a webhook, that's like an event. You're triggering the webhook, which is like publishing an event. So it doesn't have to use a message bus to be qualified as a message. I've got some tips here. So when we put all of our messages on a canvas and we can see them all in one place, we can start going through these tips. So do the names of these messages make sense? Do we have an event which is about one concept and another event which is a similar thing but uses a different word? We can challenge the message type. What if we took this command and made it an event? How would that change the coupling? Do we have too many messages here? If you can't fit all of your messages on a canvas, that's kind of telling you we might have too much here. And if you have too many messages, maybe you're exposing too much, because every event you expose is the internal state of your context being exposed publicly. The more events you expose, the more coupling your context could have. And you can experiment. You can have multiple canvases and say, what if we take this event and take it from this context and let this context over here publish it? don't have to have all message kinds for all contexts. It's fine. You might just have events from one context. That's fine too. And then we get to the final section, which is about dependencies. So a message supplier is someone who supplies a message, a context or a service which makes a query on your context, issues a command or an event you subscribe to. Those are your suppliers. And any messages coming out of your context go to your consumers. They consume your messages. And so as a starting point, we can think about these three different kinds of dependency. We have other bounded contexts, we have external systems, and we have front ends or maybe API gateways. People are also talking about UI fragments and things. So these aren't the only ones, but by having this structure, it makes you think, which contexts are coupled to us? Which external systems will we care about this? Which front ends will be using our context? So it's like another one of those checklists, giving a bit of structure to make sure you don't miss things. And so when we talk about relationship, all I recommend here is a simple text description. Like, why are these two contexts or services communicating? So the BPT website, the Business Property Tax website, has a relationship because it wants to view the register. It wants to display that stuff on a web page for citizens. As a starting point, this is perfect as a relationship. If you're more advanced with DDD, or you want to take things further, then domain-driven design also has some specific patterns, relationship patterns called context mapping patterns, like an open host service, a conformist, a partnership, big ball of mud, separate ways. I'm not going to talk about all of these now, but you can also show these context map patterns on your canvas. And again, we created another repo on github.com DDD crew, sharing these context mapping patterns. So Michael Plod, he's based in Germany. He created these patterns. He's created some Miro templates. And again, it's Creative Commons. It's free to use and pull requests are welcome. So some more stuff that hopefully you'll find useful. And then you might be wondering, well, I've created a canvas. I've looked at this canvas all day. I'm happy with it. What do I do next? We also have the aggregate design canvas for designing aggregates inside a bounded context. I'm not going to talk about this too much today, but it's just an example. You don't have to do this next. Just wanted to share this with you. So I've been talking for about 40 minutes. I'm almost finished. I want to quickly give you a preview of the next iteration of the bounded context canvas. And as I said a few times already, we're always open to new ideas and suggestions. It's on GitHub. Anyone can create a pull request. It's a community effort. No one owns this or is profiting from this or is controlling this in a dictatorial way. It's all available. And if you're thinking, well, I'm just a newcomer to DDD. I don't know what any of this stuff means. I can't possibly contribute. Actually, you can. Like the tools we're creating, we're trying to make it easier for people who are new to DDD to benefit from DDD. So actually, if you're a beginner, your suggestions and feedback, it's the best suggestions and feedback. So you're definitely welcome. Any small thing, like you might say this one thing doesn't make sense. And there might be thousands of other people who are thinking the same thing, but they haven't spoken up. So you could be that one person who makes a big improvement. So if you do want to contribute, you can go to github.com DDD crew, bounded context canvas, excuse me, and we have an open issue called the bounded context canvas v4. You can put comments in here. You can upload pictures in here. Just come and have a look at the conversation. You're definitely welcome. So here's what we've got. Here's the exciting new sneak preview, option 1. So what we try to do here is we try to show some directionality. So we have messages coming in from the left, business rules and language in the middle, and then we have messages going out. And then we have the consumers who consume the messages beneath the messages produced by us to show that the messages coming in from here are coming from these suppliers. With the old version of the canvas, people weren't sure supplier, consumer, consumer, supplier. Is it this way, this way? Do these things line up? It wasn't clear. So what we tried to do here is make those things line up more clearly. Yeah, the messages come in here and they come from these suppliers. These things line up. We have another option. Someone suggested, why don't we put the collaborators next to the messages so we can see where the messages are coming from? So if there's an event we subscribe to, where's that coming from? If there's an event we publish, where's it going to? It would be nice to show these things. What we've also experimented with here is we've replaced the word messages because of the async communication problem, confusion, and we're calling it inbound communication and outbound communication. We're also renaming model traits to domain roles. We think that might be clearer, although still maybe it can be improved. And then we had some feedback on this one from a complete beginner who said, why are the messages, why are there no queries, for example? And because we put this line in between collaborator and messages, it wasn't clear what we meant. So what we meant is it's actually swim lanes. So in each horizontal lane, the website is issuing this query, and this command. The sales context is publishing these events. So we thought this might make it clearer. And if we do things this way, we can also show these context mapping patterns like conformist and open host service. So we then start getting into the point where, is this getting a bit too complex now? Is it too much information? So we're trying to find a balance there, which is friendly for beginners, but also as useful as it possibly can be. And then people have started suggesting a bunch of other stuff we could do here. So why don't we show the team that owns the bounded context, use some team topologies, terminology, and patterns here? Why don't we add non-functional requirements like scalability, uptime? Why don't we talk about the business policies and constraints like how many, I can't think of an example right now, but just adding more information about business rules and policies. People talk about a decision log, like why did you make these choices, like an architectural decision record. And so now we're starting to get into this space where people have lots of different ideas, and it would make the canvas huge if we show all this information. So now we're talking about some kind of hierarchical model when we have a canvas at this level, another canvas, an extension, a diagram, almost like a documentation template, which helps you capture all of this information. So again, if you see anything on the canvas and you're thinking, we should really have this bit of information on the canvas, yeah, we're open to new ideas too, and even new canvases. Yeah, so you can join the conversation here. And finally, I want to talk about, there are people who've started building automated tools. So one company who I work with called Software Park, they've built this tool called Contexture. It's an open source tool, and basically you start by creating a domain. You type the name of your domain and what your domain vision statement is. And then you can start adding subdomains and bounded contexts as part of the tool. You can have this information all available in the system. And what they're looking at is actually automating it. So the messages, for example, and the policies, looking at a code base and automatically extracting that information and displaying it on the canvas. And that way, the canvas stays in sync always. It never gets out of date. It's like a living documentation. And also you can use this for collaboration. So the company they're working with at the moment who are using this tool, they've got domain experts entering some information and the architects and developers entering other bits of information. And it's useful for collaboration around ubiquitous language, for example. So hope you found that exciting. I found it exciting working on this, and it's all because of like the COVID. Like a lot of my travel and conferences were canceled. So I thought, what could I do interesting? What could we do useful in this time? And other people got involved too. And if you're thinking the same thing, like, how can I be useful in this COVID era? Yeah, you can help out too. So I'm finished. Thank you very much for listening. Hopefully all of that made sense and it was clear. But if it didn't, I'm available for questions and things now. So I'll hand back over to you.
Okay, thanks a lot, Nick. I really appreciate it, your talk. It was, I learned a lot. So people can ask their questions on chats. And Nick, I just let you see there's already 1 or 2 questions, I think. So I let you just check them if it's okay for you, or you want I do it by myself.
Yeah, either's fine. I guess I haven't been looking at the chat, so if you want to read them out, that's fine too.
I'm just recording the video, so okay, I will start. I will go on the top of the messages. So the first one. Okay, sorry, I'm finding the questions. Okay, so Minhali Rajeshkar asked, is it okay to issue comments from one VC to another?
Well, it's okay, but it might not be okay. So there are a few things to keep in mind. So typically when we talk about commands or not, we're talking about a bigger concept, which is orchestration versus choreography, where if we have a command, then we can keep all of our logic in one place. Send a command to this context, get a response, and a command to that context, get a response. And so our workflow lives in a centralized place, and that can be a good thing. But the problem with commands is it can also lead to additional coupling. So you can end up trying to put all of your workflow in one place, and then you get bits of logic from other contexts creeping into what's called a process manager. So the decision around commands is, where do you want to put the coupling? So a decision needs to be made somewhere. If you send a command, the context sending the command makes a decision about what happens next. If you publish an event, the context listening to the command, listening to the event, gets to decide what happens next. I wrote a blog post recently about one of the patterns called the library context. So if you had a library where a physical library, people walk in, they get a book, would that be commands or events? So the example I gave is, imagine you're a student and you have an exam coming up, a history exam, a geography exam. You need a book to help you revise for the exam. So the event is, user has an exam. Does the library need to know that the user's having an exam and give the user a book? Or does the user walk to the library and issue a command, give me this book? So in this example, if a library had to know about every single reason someone could want a book, it would become very coupled. So the question, I guess, is how many kinds of events could there be? So if you have lots of bounded contexts and they all need to call another bounded context for different reasons, and you don't want the context to know about all of those reasons, the other context can just say, look, send me a command asking for a book and I'll give you a book. I don't care why you need a book. So yeah, a command can be definitely useful sometimes.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So Tanner from DDD Istanbul. Is there any rule kind of fitting canvas to any paper size, for example, A3 or A4?
I always try and use a nice big sheet of flip chart paper. Normally I'm doing this in like a workshop setting. We've got an event storm on the wall, have a canvas. The bigger the piece of paper, the easier it is for more people to stand up, put post-its, move them around. Obviously, if you're doing this online, then size doesn't really matter that much. But you could, if you're just doing it yourself, for example, you could do it on a smaller piece of paper.
Okay, thank you. So again, Minahali Rajashekar asked, is integration be a core domain when our solution is orchestrating business process across two or more COTS application? COTS is COTS.
Yeah. So I've worked in one of those core domains. I worked for a company who were building marketing automation, and the tool would put advertising campaigns on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, Google. It would run campaigns on Google. So yeah, all of the complexity was in the orchestration, managing the integration with those external services and making decisions about which calls to make and things. So yeah, I think it could be a core domain. It doesn't automatically need to be a core domain just because it's doing the orchestration. I would say most of the time, it's probably not your core domain if it's doing the integration orchestration, but it definitely could be. I guess that's where, I'm just going to flip forward. That's where you might find this tool useful. Just putting all of your bounded context on here and asking the business to say, how important do they think each bounded context is? And then the business might say, well, the integration's not that important. It's maybe halfway across. But then you might say, well, it's not important, but it's super complex. And it's very difficult for other companies to do this. So it might be your core domain because it's complex, even though the business don't think it's as important as other things. So yeah, it could be.
Okay, thank you. I have two more general questions about DDD. So first of all, Mr. Dragon asked why DDD is important.
Well, I think that domain-driven design to me is really just common sense. It's common sense, and then people have given it lots of confusing words like bounded context, ubiquitous language, core domain. So we didn't make it an easy thing, but it's actually just common sense in my opinion. It's about finding what's important. It's about talking to the domain experts, and it's about treating software design importantly so that the code is easier to change over time. And I think maybe if we look at the industry at the moment, people are now starting to complain about microservices. Oh, microservices was the big thing 6 or 7 years ago. And now suddenly everyone's beating up microservices now because they focused on things like Kubernetes and Docker, and micro is about size. Like none of those things were really about, let's work closely with the business and let's think about design. Because those things are like, you can't package up those things. You can't just make your services smaller. Yeah, that's easy, but it's not very beneficial. Whereas DDD is all about trying to convince people, yeah, spend some time thinking about the domain, try and collaborate, and then think about design, how you name things, how you structure things, how you organize things. Think about language, like what does tomato mean here versus over here? Those things don't sound very exciting and techy. So maybe that's why DDD is important, but also why it's not so popular.
Thank you. Another question, I think you already answered, but I will ask it again. How to start with DDD in a real project? How to think DDD?
Yeah, so this is a difficult one to answer with a definite clear answer, because it depends on many things. It depends on, has your company decided we like the idea of DDD, we're going to do it? Or is it one or two people in the company who like the idea, but not everyone else is ready to try it yet? So depending on which of those spectrums and extremes you're closer to, depends on what you do next. So if your company has decided we like DDD, how do we do it properly? Then this process I was talking about, I think this is a good starting point. And if you go to the github.com page, we've given examples of things you can do at each stage. So you can start with a business model canvas, then you can try event storming, then the message flows, the core domain grid we just looked at, the bounded context canvas. Like, I think this is a useful starting point. This is what I would use as a starting point if I'm working with a company. If you're in a legacy system, then you might do things a different way. You might have like, oh, we've already got our team boundaries, so the number 6 is already done for you, and that's maybe not so important. Or you might already have an architecture, and you might create a bounded context canvas for your existing system as a starting point. Or you might even start with the code. Or you could start with step 5. Okay, what's our core domain? Let's start there, and then let's go from step 5 to step 8. Let's go to our core domain, and let's try and clean up or extract the key part of our core domain. So this process is also like a toolkit of things you can do in any order to get started. If you're just one person, then I would say event storming is good. If you can have a good event storming session and people can get one of those wow moments, I think that can open a lot of doors and encourage people. So one event storming session I always talk about when people ask me, what's a wow moment? So there was a fintech company in London. I think it was 2017. And I said, what does this word mean here? And the developer said, it's a calculation, and it's calculated this way. And then the marketing manager, the head of marketing, she said, no, it's not calculated that way. It's calculated another way. And the developer says, well, I wrote the code, yeah? I know how it works. And then she said, oh, maybe it doesn't work how I thought it did. That would explain why all of our marketing campaigns aren't making sense or working like we thought they would. And then she actually left the workshop to go look at this immediately. So if you can get to one of those moments where people learn something and see the value of collaboration, the doors are open to doing more of the DDD stuff. But you could also start with step 5. Just draw this 2x2 grid, put all of your microservices on it, or your bounded context, or your modules in your monolith, and just talk about which is the most important and why, and how might they move in time over the future. And just having those discussions about the big picture, the strategy, that can encourage people to dig deeper into the domain and discover things like, oh, I'm not sure actually, let's go event storm it.
Okay, thank you. So ZS asked, why is it recommended to use DDD? And I think we already talked about that, but the second part not. And so he asked when to use it.
Okay, so firstly, domain-driven design is quite a big kit of tools, which you can use in a lot of different situations. So event storming, for example, you can use that anytime really. If you want to get your developers and your domain experts together and other people too, and just model your domain and just discover some things, identify some problems, help developers extract some domain experts' knowledge. You can do that at any time, really. Then we start getting to the strategy, step 5 and step 7. I think it's always good to have an idea of what's the long term of our architecture. How do we think things will evolve over time? Again, you can do that at any time, really. And then there's step 8, which is about cleaning up your code using tactical patterns like aggregates. And again, you can use those things when you see an opportunity in the code. So I would look at domain-driven design as more of a toolkit of things you can pick and choose from. And the best sign is you're doing DDD and you're not calling it DDD. Like if you tell people we're going full DDD, we're going to do DDD on all of our projects everywhere, you're setting a very high bar of expectation there. Whereas if you can see a problem in your team or an opportunity and you can say, oh, this concept from DDD can work here, that's much more effective and you'll get some benefit straight away. And if it doesn't work out, you haven't given DDD a bad reputation in your company. So to answer your question, I would think of it as a toolkit and try and use each of those tools when it's necessary. And then if these tools are working for you, maybe you can explain to people, yeah, this overall concept is called DDD, and there's some other stuff we could try too.
Thank you. So again, Minahali Rajashekar asked, where would we put a supplementary or complementary solution or apps to, say, Salesforce in a core domain chart?
Good question. So you are probably looking at generic. So a good example here is payments. If my system needs to take payments, then this would be generic because it's not specific to our domain. Payments is common in lots of domains, and it's a tool we can buy off the shelf. And so there's very little differentiation. The question is, if we build payments ourselves, can we get some benefit over other companies who we are competing with? If the answer is no, there's no benefit, then it's all the way to the left in the bottom corner and it's generic. And you probably want to consider that as, yeah, something off the shelf. It's generic. It's not our core domain, but there's always an exception. There's always an exception to everything. That's what I like about DDD. It's always an edge case. So the company called Slack, who made a chat system, Slack, they used to be a company that made video games, and Slack was just an internal chat system they built themselves. Now, at the time, that chat system was generic. They could have used an IRC or Skype, but they built their own chat system. So it was generic, but they built it in-house. And then they made no money from their video games, and the company was about to go bankrupt. And they said, what if we turn our chat system into a product? And it went from being generic to being their core domain. So if it's an off-the-shelf product, it's probably generic, but there's always an edge case. Hopefully that's useful in some way.
Oh, perfect. Okay, so Mohsen asked, is microservices dead?
What does microservices mean? I don't think it was ever alive. I don't think we ever got to a consistent definition of microservices. So for me, we just had to call architecture microservices. Otherwise, people wouldn't listen to us. So I think design will never be dead. Thinking about how should we shape our system? Where are the boundaries? What kind of messages do we need? How will we organize our teams? All of those things will always be important. Microservices didn't make them go away, and they still haven't gone away. And so with or without microservices, it's still the same. So I think microservices was more just a marketing label. And I think it did have some good ideas around it about going from monoliths to loosely coupled architectures. But Yeah, I don't know if it's dead or if it will come back or if there'll be a new name for microservices, but I saw people doing SOA 10 years ago, which was similar to how some people do microservices now. So I don't really know. We'll see, I guess.
Okay, thank you. So Ismail asked, what is a generic domain in DDD?
Yep. So a generic domain is something which isn't specific to our company, and we should probably try and buy it off the shelf if we can. So if I'm a company which is selling holidays, then the core parts of my company are helping people to find and buy holidays, having good holidays, giving recommendations about holidays. Those things might be core supporting. But things like CRM, yeah, my company needs a CRM, but every company needs a CRM. We need to take payments, but every company needs to take payments. So those, every company needs them. Those are your generic things.
Okay.
And it's not always clear sometimes. Those are the obvious examples, but sometimes it's a bit less clear.
Yes, it's always hard to define different bounded context types. So then Mario asked, is facilitating communications or meeting an important aspect of DDD?
I think good facilitation skills will get you a long way with DDD or anything really. Since I started doing workshops and meetups some years ago, I made so many mistakes and learned from those mistakes. And I just found just small tricks that work, like icebreaker activities. And like when you have a large group of people and they're starting to go away from off topic or they're getting stuck in circular debates, sometimes you feel like, I don't want to interrupt all these people here. But when you start facilitating workshops, you get confident and you say, look, let's try this activity, or I think this is a good conversation, but we need to come back to it later. You just get the confidence to step in. You see problems and you can stop them. But also when you facilitate activities like event storming, for example, you start to see patterns there too, like good things to aim for and bad practices. Like if you see people on their mobile phone, or if you see people don't seem interested, you just pick up on all of these signals, and you know how to get things back on track. So yeah, good facilitation skills are really useful. I don't consider myself to be the best facilitator, but I'm certainly learning from practice.
Thank you. Mohsen asked how we can know that a system is legacy. What is the key features that show a system is legacy?
You need a certificate from Michael Feathers, who wrote the legacy codebook, because I don't think anyone else really knows exactly what legacy means, unfortunately. There's a definition which is if it doesn't have tests, it's legacy, but I don't know if that's the only kind of legacy. I've also worked with companies who talked about heritage systems. I'm like, what? Heritage? What does that mean? They said a heritage system is like a legacy system's grandparents. It's so old, like 30 years old. So I don't really know if there's a clear-cut definition of legacy. I guess it's code that's hard to work with is the general definition.
Yeah, okay. Very well. So again, Rasul asked, can DDD speed up engineering process in a startup project? Does it really make process rapid, or the complexity of implementation would make it worse?
So some bits of DDD will be useful. Some bits of DDD won't be useful. Things like event storming can be very useful. So I've got this quote I've been using for a while, which is 2 weeks of coding can save 2 hours of event storming. So recently I worked with a team, we built a feature which took 2 weeks, and we just kept hitting these dead ends. Or we wrote some code and we realized, oh, this doesn't make sense anymore. We need to, there's something missing here. We need to make this code work and compile. We need more business input. And we kept going backwards and forwards, rewriting the code every day for like 2 weeks. If we'd have spent 2 hours just having an event storming session with the domain experts, we would have found all of these hidden edge cases very quickly. And we would have saved 2 weeks. So event storming can be useful there. Now, when we talk about the tactical patterns like aggregates and bounded contexts, for me, I just find those things natural anyway. Like it doesn't take me any extra effort to create an aggregate versus not creating an aggregate. And when I do create an aggregate, I think it pays off clearly, because to me, an aggregate's a state machine, and representing these states in the domain just helped me to write the code quickly in the first place. When we talk about event sourcing, that can have a bit of overhead. And if your team's not familiar with it, it can take a bit of a learning ramp. So that might be something where if you're in a startup, you might postpone event sourcing. If your team's not comfortable with aggregates, you might, I don't know, I think it depends how your team works, what skill level you have. But there are definitely people who've taken code bases, put lots of DDD patterns in there when it didn't need to be. So the typical example is a CRUD system. If you're just putting stuff in a database and taking it back out of a database and you have no rules, you don't need aggregates there. You probably don't need you can just write your domain in SQL, like SQL query in, get the response. Like I even saw a blog post recently where someone was saying, forget about DDD, your database can return JSON and just send it straight out of your API. Like stream your database JSON response straight to the client. And I think that's also valid. It's like, if your system's simple and you don't have any domain rules, forget about the tactical patterns. And also, if you're in a startup and getting things out quicker is the goal, then it's okay to take shortcuts. But I don't know I wouldn't always say ignore DDD because it's quicker, because it's not always quicker sometimes. Sometimes, like I said about the event storming, or thinking about your domain as a state machine and modeling that as an aggregate, just thinking about the state machine first, thinking about the states in your code, clarifying that before you start coding can actually save you time when you're coding. So yes, if you're in a startup, you can ignore DDD as a general rule, but edge cases. Like maybe this is an easier way to explain it. If you're happy to throw the code base away in 6 months and rewrite it when you've got some feedback about your business, then it doesn't really matter what patterns you use. If you're planning to keep the code base and evolve it over 1, 2, 3 years, then maybe using the patterns can be more justified.
Perfect. So again, we have Mario that asked, when is the right time to start DDD in a project? Does it need to be right at the project inception?
So I find event storming is useful almost always, really. If you've got a bunch of people working in the same company, asking them to model their domain with event storming, everyone will learn something from the workshop if you do it properly. And that knowledge is just, it pays you back every day. The developers understand the domain more. That pays you back every day. Features are easier to implement because they know how the domain works. And the developers might spot hidden edge cases. You might identify missing product features, which helps with your roadmap. So that can be useful at any time. I think identifying your core domains and your supporting, like when would you not want to know that? Like one thing I say to companies is, like I say to like a CTO or VP of engineering, how do you know that every person in this company is working on the most important things they could be working on right now? And normally they don't have an answer. I'm like, doesn't that concern you that you don't know what the most important things are and they don't? So if you capture your core domains and you can anticipate, like we think in the next 1 to 2 years, this thing will be our new core domain, and everyone can be focused on, yeah, I'm working on this supporting domain to help our new core domain. I know I'm working on the right thing. So those things are usually always useful. The edge case to look out for is if you've got a tight deadline coming up and you have to hit the deadline, then taking time out to do some DDD stuff might be a bad idea. Like, get to your deadline first and then try event storming after.
Thank you. So we have a last question, which comes from Zahra. She asked if we have a very legacy system and want to step-by-step break it to bounded context and try to go through DDD, is there any book or guideline to break it?
So there are some patterns you can put together. And I think this process we talked about earlier can be a useful starting point. So capture the business model first, because when you're breaking up your legacy system, you have to decide which things do we break out first, which order. Actually, I'm gonna switch to my web browser here and show you something else quickly. So there's another version of this chart we use. All right, I'm gonna just stop sharing and share a different screen. So here's something you can use. So basically, we've modified the chart to represent our architecture migration. So some parts of our monolith will be simple to extract. Maybe it's a small service, it's not coupled to anything. We can break this out as a new service in a couple of weeks. But some things will be very difficult to break out. Now, the problem is, if you start with the simple things, there might be no business benefit. And the business will say, it's really cool you spent 6 months breaking out these microservices, but we're not seeing any benefit whatsoever. It hasn't changed anything for the business. So you might say, well, let's take out a piece of the monolith, which does have some business benefit. If we break out this service first, we can add new features much more quickly in that service, and the business will notice the benefits. But those things which are easy to break out might be very complicated to break out. And so doing that first can be very risky because it might go wrong. So what you might say is, well, we'll start here in the bottom right-hand corner. We'll extract services from the monolith, which are easy to break out, and they have some business benefit. Then we have to make a choice. Do we want to take things which are simple but low value? Or do we want to take a bit more risk, break out more complex services, but we know that once we break them out, there's more value. So yeah, so in terms of the process for legacy, I would say, again, capture the business model. Then you can analyze things in this way, by creating your roadmap based on priorities. And you can also do event storming to map out the current domain. And on your event storm, you can identify where are the problems, the coupling, the issues. And on the event storm, the business can tell you, yeah, these parts of the domain, we think these bits are important. So you can build up that picture. And then you can kind of design a target architecture. So you can design the new system you'd like to have. You design a new target architecture. Then you create your plan for getting there using this 2x2 chart here. And then you can use tactical patterns for helping you get there. So you can use patterns like the bubble context we saw earlier, and the autonomous bubble, and things like an anti-corruption layer. So yeah, I think that's what I would do. I would always want to say, okay, before I can advise this company how to break up your architecture into microservices, I need to know your business model. I need to model your domain. I need to get some sense of which things are important, which order should we do things. And I need to understand where's the complexity in your domain, which bits are difficult. And then I would also say, what's the target architecture you want to get to? So we all have some vision of what we're trying to achieve. And I think DDD can help with all of those steps. And there are other things too, like C4 architecture and other concepts.
Thank you. Yeah, this one was one of the very frequent questions that I hear. We had another question from Hamid Fakuri. Is there any book that can help us about event granularity in event source applications? Or can you give us some advice about it?
Yeah, so event granularity is quite an interesting topic. I think that goes back to when we start talking about aggregates and modeling our system as a state machine. The size of the events, I just think for event sourced applications, the internal events that which are event source, the size of those, I don't really notice. Like the domain event happens, and usually it's obvious how big the event needs to be. There's not too much flexibility there. Where I do find the event size is when we start talking about external events or public events, which are shared between bounded contexts. And that's when we have the choice between fat and thin messages. The trade-off there is all about coupling. So the bigger you make your events, the easier it is for the consumer to get the information they need because all the information is in one event. But then you're exposing more and it's more coupling. And I recently worked on a system with giant messages, like giant messages in Kafka. It was like they got 5 database tables and put them all in a Kafka message. And you're doing joins in a Kafka message, way too big. So I normally go towards smaller messages as a default, because the smaller the message, the smaller the coupling. But then if you expose more messages, you're still increasing the coupling. So that's where when we look at the bounded context canvas, we can see the messages. We can kind of get a trade-off. Oh, we might have these 5 events we're publishing. We could actually condense those into one summary event. So we only expose one event, that's less coupling, even though it's a fatter event. That's all I can think of there right now. Sorry about that.
Okay, very well. We had another one from Ali Reza Maliki. He asked, as DDD heavily depends on the business domain and having enough knowledge of the whole business domain is almost impossible for every developer in the parenthesis, either junior or senior. How can developer cope with this problem? If you want, I can repeat the question.
Yeah, I think there were a few things there. But as a junior developer, I think can you repeat the question, please?
Yeah, sure. So as DDD heavily depends on the business domain and having enough knowledge of the whole business domain is almost impossible for every developer, for example, junior or senior. How developers can cope with this problem? That's the question.
Yeah, so unfortunately, that's one of the limitations of human hardware, that we're not capable of understanding a whole domain. And so pretty much everything we do in software and DDD is all about working with those constraints. So again, event storming is useful because you can event storm a whole domain. And even if you don't work in certain parts of the domain, you can learn things about the bits you don't work on. But it's not possible to have every person from your company in an event storming workshop. So that doesn't solve the problem. If we talk about remote sessions, we can actually capture our event storm as a Miro board, and we can share that with people. I think that's a future concept that we might see being useful. And then it really comes down to, how does your company share information between teams? How can people get knowledge about things they don't work on? So when I was a junior, I worked in a company who did rotation and pairing. So I got to rotate into other teams and do pair programming with them to learn about their domain, bits of their domain. And I found it very useful. And again, as we talked about earlier, facilitation skills. If you offer to facilitate sessions for other teams and you get known as a facilitator, people will ask you to facilitate their sessions and you get to learn about their parts of the domain. So one of the other things actually, so I do care about this problem. I think it will be solved in the future. My vision of the future, it might be 5 years, it might be 10 years, it might even be longer, is that your software, your code is a database of domain information, right? We treat software as text files which are compiled, but each text file is rules from your domain. Like your code base is a database of your domain rules. So in the future, I think we'll have tools that can visualize a code base as the domain. And that way you can just look at any code base and it will visualize it in like an event storm style. And you can learn about bits of the domain you don't work on. Imagine you start a new team tomorrow. How long does it take you to learn about their code base and their parts of the domain? Imagine you went to the code base and you said, render this code in my screen as an event storm. That would be super powerful, right? You would learn way tens or hundreds of times quicker how the code works and how the domain works. When I was talking earlier about the Contexture tool, I've seen a few companies going down that direction, like living documentation, systems that describe themselves. I think that's the long-term solution for definite. And I'm really excited about that.
Very well. I think we are finished with the questions. Okay, just someone asked, what's the tool name?
The tool was Contexture. So github.com, I'll share my slides after this talk, so don't worry if you don't get this, but if you go to github.com software part, they have a tool called Contexture. Why don't I give you a quick demo now? So if you go to their GitHub page, there's a link to their demo. And here's something I created earlier. So here's my domain. Here's a domain called blah. If I look at this domain, you can change the name. Let's call it DDD Iran domain. A great domain for great people. And then, so you save that, and then you can start adding bounded context in here. So here's all the stuff I showed you earlier. Like this is just a demo for now. I think they started working on it like 6 or 8 weeks ago. So it's not a very new product, but you can download the code, run it yourself. And also, if you go to the bounded context canvas GitHub repository, there are some other tools in here. So other people have created other versions. So someone created a HTML version here. Basically with this version, you leave it in your code base next to your code. So it's easier to keep them in sync. And when you change it, you've got a version control history of how your bounded context canvas changed. There's also a French version. So He wrote an article translating it into French. I can't find it now. I think it might be in resources. Yeah, so he created the French version too. So yeah, there's a few tools out there. People are sending in new ideas all the time. If you have an idea and you want to share it, that would be cool too.
Okay, very useful. People loved this tool. Okay, I think this time we are finished. Nick, do you have any comments to finish the talk?
Well, I would just like to say thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all of the questions. Believe it or not, the more questions, the happier I am. So I'm very happy today, like answering questions. And if you did like any of the ideas in this talk and you want to improve these tools, we're always happy for you to create an issue on GitHub or a pull request and to make these tools better for everyone. And the final thing I would say is just remember that DDD is a toolbox. You can use bits and pieces at the time that it's most useful. You don't have to go into your company with a big banner saying, we're going DDD tomorrow, yay. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. Just take the bits that work for you and even experiment with them and improve them.
Okay, very well. We really appreciate it, Nick. We were very happy to having you as a speaker, and I want again thanks Masoud who planified this event, and thanks Soat to recording the video. For your information, the video will be available very soon, just after editing. So we will let the link on Twitter or on LinkedIn. That's all. Thanks everyone joined us. Hope you really appreciate it, and see you soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Have a good night. Bye-bye.